I broke the only rule in the town's archive. I tore the ancient contract. Turns out, I had cancelled the deal that kept it from taking everything. My name is Dr. Alistair Finch, and I am, or perhaps was, a historian specializing in isolated communities. I believe this will be my final entry. I am writing this from a borrowed car, parked on a forgotten highway miles away from the town of Havenwood. The town is likely gone by now, erased by a silence that I, in my academic arrogance, helped to unleash. The story I am about to tell will sound like madness, but the document lying on the seat beside me, the one that smells of old paper and ozone, is proof that it was all real. It began as a research project. Havenwood was a historian's dream, a small, secluded town nestled deep in the mountains, founded in the late 1700s and seemingly untouched by the modern world. It had no internet, spotty cell service, and a population that was notoriously private. I wanted to study its founding, to understand how it had maintained its unique cultural identity for so long. After months of requests, I was finally granted access to the town archives, located in the basement of their modest town hall. The archives were a single, dusty room, managed by a quiet, elderly clerk. He gave me a simple rule. I could study anything I wanted, but the town's original leather-bound charter was not to be touched, only viewed through its glass case. Of course, that was the first thing I went to see. It was beautiful, a single, large sheet of calfskin parchment, covered in elegant, handwritten script. It was the town's founding document, its constitution. But as I read the flowery language of its preamble, I noticed the final section was different. The script was harsher, more angular, written in a faded, brownish ink. It wasn't a law or a decree. It was a contract. It spoke of a pact made with a guardian spirit of the valley, referred to only as the tithe collector, in exchange for the valley's prosperity, mild winters, bountiful harvests, and protection from the outside world. Town of Havenwood agreed to pay a tithe once every generation. The contract did not specify what this tithe was. It only stated that the collector would come to claim its due, and that to refuse the negotiation was to invite ruin. I dismissed it as fascinating folklore, a symbolic relic of a more superstitious time. I had no idea that the collection was scheduled for the very next night. That evening, I was invited to dinner by the town's mayor, a man named Elias Thorne. He was a stern, weary-looking man who seemed to carry the weight of his office in the lines on his face. He was polite but distant, answering my questions about the town's history with vague, practiced responses. I brought up the tithe collector, clause in the charter, expecting him to laugh it off as a charming piece of local mythology. He did not laugh. His face went pale, and the fork in his hand stilled over his plate. Some traditions are best left undisturbed. Doctor, he said, his voice low and tight. You are a guest here. I must ask you not to speak of this again. His reaction was so severe, so full of a genuine, palpable fear, that it sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just folklore to him. It was a real and present danger. Before I could press further, he abruptly ended our dinner, saying he had important town business to attend to. He advised me to stay in my room at the small inn for the remainder of the night. The air can be treacherous after dark, was his only explanation. My curiosity, now fully ignited, overruled my sense of self-preservation. I didn't go back to the inn. Instead, I went back to the town hall. The building was dark, save for a single light burning. In the mayor's office, on the second floor, I found a hiding spot across the town square, concealed by a large oak tree, and I waited. I was a historian, and I had stumbled upon a living piece of history. I could not just walk away, around midnight. It happened. The air grew still and cold. The chirping of the crickets ceased. A profound, unnatural silence fell over the town square. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of the square. It was tall and impossibly thin, wrapped in a heavy, dark cloak that obscured its form. It had no discernible face, just a smooth, pale oval where a face should be. It glided across the square, its feet making no sound on the cobblestones, and entered the town hall. The tithe collector was real, and it had come for its payment. I watched, my heart pounding, as the light in the mayor's office became the stage for a silent, terrifying negotiation between a mortal man and an ancient, faceless entity. The window of the mayor's office became a silent theater, and I was its sole audience. I could see their two silhouettes against the lamplight. Mayor Thorns was agitated, pacing back and forth, his movements sharp with desperation. The collector's was a statue carved from night, utterly still, its tall, thin frame radiating an aura of immovable patience. I could not hear their words, but I could read the story in their shadows. I saw Thorn's silhouette make pleading gestures. He seemed to be offering something up, holding out his hands as if presenting a gift. He was trying to negotiate, to pay the tithe with whatever currency they used in this strange, ancient transaction. The tall figure remained motionless for a long time. Then, with an agonizing slowness, it shook its head. A clear, silent, and absolute refusal. Thorn's shadow seemed to shrink, to collapse in on itself with despair. He had offered the traditional payment, and the collector had rejected it. What could be worth more? What else could it possibly want? Then the collector raised a single, impossibly long arm. It pointed, not at Thorn, not at something in the office. It pointed directly out the window. My heart stopped. Its finger was aimed directly at the old oak tree where I stood concealed. It had known I was there. It had known all along. The negotiation was not about the town's memories or their harvests. It was not about some symbolic offering. I had thought I was an observer, a chronicler of this strange ritual. I was wrong. I was not the audience. This time, the tithe was the historian who had come to uncover their secrets. The price was me. A wave of pure, icy terror washed over me, rooting me to the spot. The silhouette in the window, the long, pointing finger, it was a death sentence. I had stumbled into a ritual that was not meant for outside eyes, and in doing so, I had become the sacrifice. From the office window, I saw Mayor Thorn's silhouette slump into a chair, his posture one of utter defeat. The collector's silhouette turned and glided out of the office. A moment later, the heavy front doors of the town hall swung open. The tall, cloaked figure emerged and began to move across the town square, directly towards me. My legs finally unlocked. I turned and ran. I sprinted through the sleeping, silent streets of Havenwood, my lungs on fire, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel its presence behind me. There was no sound of pursuit, no footsteps, but I could feel its cold, relentless focus, a psychic pressure that made the air behind me feel thick and heavy. I ran past the quaint houses, past the darkened storefronts, the entire town, once a subject of my academic curiosity, was now a labyrinth, a hunting ground. I realized with a sickening jolt that Thorn had not warned me to stay inside for my own safety. He had done it to keep the sacrifice from running. I reached the edge of town, the dirt road that led back to the outside world, back to my car. Safety was just a few hundred yards away, and then I saw it, standing in the middle of the road. Blocking my path was the tall, featureless silhouette of the tithe collector. It had not been chasing me. It had been waiting for me. I skidded to a halt, my mind reeling. There was no escape. It had me trapped. It raised its long, pale hand, not in a threatening gesture, but in a simple, beckoning motion. It was telling me to come, to accept my fate, to be collected. And a part of my mind, the part that was paralyzed with terror, was tempted to obey. I stood on that dirt road, caught between the suffocating town and the silent, waiting entity. My mind was a whirlwind of primal fear. It beckoned again, a slow, deliberate curl of its long fingers. The gesture was not a request. It was a command, a summons. But as I stood on the verge of surrendering, a different instinct took over. The historian in me, the part that was driven by logic and a need for understanding, rebelled against the raw, supernatural terror. This creature operated on rules, a contract, a negotiation, a tithe. It was not a mindless beast. It was an ancient, lawful entity. And that meant its power had limits. The contract, the town charter, the original document was my only hope. It was the source of all this, the legal and spiritual foundation for this entire nightmare. If I could get to it, maybe I could find a loophole, a forgotten clause, a way to break the agreement. It was an insane, desperate gamble. The collector stood between me and my car, but the town hall, with the charter in its basement, was behind me. I would have to run back into the heart of the trap. I didn't give myself time to think. I spun around and sprinted back into the silent streets of Havenwood, away from the collector. I could feel its surprise, a faint ripple of confusion in the cold, psychic pressure behind me. It had not expected this. It had expected submission. I ran with a new purpose, no longer a panicked animal, but a man with a desperate plan. I reached the town hall, its doors still unlocked. I burst inside and flew down the narrow staircase to the basement archives. The room was cold and smelled of old paper. There, in the center of the room, was the glass display case. I didn't hesitate. I picked up a heavy wooden chair and, with a desperate cry, brought it down on the glass. The case shattered with a loud ringing crash, the sound an act of pure sacrilege in the hallowed silence of the archives. I reached through the broken glass, my hands shaking, and snatched the ancient calfskin parchment, the original charter, the contract. I held it in my hands, its surface cool and brittle. I frantically scanned the archaic text, my eyes searching for any word, any phrase that could save me. And then I found it. A small addendum written at the very bottom in the same angular, brownish ink as the original pact. It was a single, cryptic line. Should the tithe be refused, the contract is rendered void, and the valley shall reclaim its own. The valley shall reclaim its own. The words were archaic, ambiguous, but they were my only hope. I had refused the tithe by running. I had not submitted. Did that mean the contract was broken? I heard a slow, deliberate sound from the top of the stairs. The sound of something without feet gliding across the wooden floor. It was coming. The collector was no longer waiting. I had committed a transgression by breaking the case and stealing the charter. The time for rules was over. I clutched the parchment in my hand, my mind racing. What did it mean? The valley shall reclaim its own. It didn't mean the collector would leave. It meant something else would happen. A consequence. A reset. I had no other choice. It was a gamble on the words of a long-dead scribe against the ancient power that was now descending the stairs. I stood in the center of the archive room, holding the charter aloft like a shield. I refuse. I shouted into the darkness, my voice, a raw, desperate cry. The tithe is refused. The contract is void. The figure of the collector appeared in the doorway at the bottom of the stairs. The darkness around it seemed to deepen, to coalesce. The featureless void where its face should be seemed to fixate on the document in my hands. It raised its long arm, but not to beckon this time. It was reaching for me, to take me by force. And then I made the final, catastrophic mistake in a moment of pure, panicked defiance. Believing that destroying the contract would sever its power completely, I did the unthinkable. I ripped the ancient parchment in two. The sound of the tearing calfskin was quiet, but it seemed to echo in the basement with the force of a thunderclap. For a single, heart-stopping moment, everything was still. The collector froze, its hand outstretched. The air grew heavy, charged with a new, immense power. Then, from the torn edges of the contract in my hands, a substance began to ooze. It was not ink. It was a thick, black, viscous liquid, glistening in the faint light. It was the color of liquid night. It dripped onto the floor, not as a liquid, but as a dissipating mist, a dark energy being released. It was the essence of the pact, the prosperity of the valley, the magic that kept the harvests bountiful and the winters mild. It was the lifeblood of Havenwood, and I had just opened its veins. The collector slowly retracted its hand. It wasn't looking at me anymore. It was looking at the dying contract, a silent, ancient witness to my folly. I hadn't broken its power. I had just unleashed a far greater and more indiscriminate destruction. The black, inky essence poured from the torn parchment, a torrent of dying magic. It flowed onto the floor and did not puddle. It spread out, sinking into the stone, and the entire building began to groan, a deep, resonant sound of agony. The floor beneath my feet trembled. The collector remained motionless, a silent statue of judgment. Its role was over. The contract was broken. Now, the penalty phase began. I dropped the two halves of the charter as if they were burning coals and scrambled out of the archives. Up the shaking staircase. The town hall was transforming around me. The wooden walls, once solid and aged, were now graying, turning brittle, splintering and cracking before my eyes. A fine, grey dust, like ash, began to fill the air. I burst out into the town square. The idyllic, charming village of Havenwood was dying. The vibrant colours of the neat little houses were fading, bleeding away into a uniform, monochromatic grey. The cobblestones under my feet were crumbling, turning to dust. The leaves on the old oak tree withered and fell in a cascade of brown decay. The very life force of the valley was draining away, its stolen vitality returning to the earth, and the people, doors began to open. The townsfolk stumbled out of their homes, not in a panic, but in a slow, dazed confusion. Their faces, once healthy and rosy, were now pale and gaunt. They looked as if they had aged 50 years in a matter of minutes. They looked at their own hands, at the crumbling facades of their homes, their expressions turning to ones of dawning, horror. They had lived on borrowed time, and their credit had just run out. A woman pointed a trembling finger at me. "You," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "You did this." They all turned to look at me, their eyes no longer filled with neighborly warmth, but with a hollow, empty accusation. They were the valley, and I was the one who had taken what was theirs. They began to shuffle towards me, a slow, silent, grey mob. They were not angry. They were just empty, and they seemed to be drawn to the last source of vibrant life in their dying world. Me, I backed away from the advancing, grey crowd. Their movements were slow, shambling, but relentless. Their eyes were hollow, fixed on me with a terrifying, vacant hunger. They were like plants, turning toward the last ray of sunlight. The life that I had stolen from their valley, they intended to take back from me personally. Panic seized me. I turned and ran, my feet kicking up clouds of grey dust from the crumbling cobblestones. The town was a ghost of itself. The buildings were skeletal, the air thick with the dust of decay. I glanced over my shoulder. The silent, grey mob was following, their numbers growing as more and more residents emerged from their dying homes. I ran for the dirt road, the only way out of town. My car was still there, a single point of solid, colourful reality in this monochrome nightmare. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so violently I could barely fit the key into the lock. I threw myself inside and slammed the door. Through the windshield, I saw them coming. The crowd of hollowed-out townsfolk shuffling down the road. Their pale, gaunt faces, a sea of silent accusation. I twisted the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. I tried again, nothing. It was as if the car itself, being within the valley's influence, was being drained of its mechanical life. They were getting closer. I could see their empty eyes, their grasping, grey hands. In a final, desperate act, I tried the ignition one last time. The engine roared to life with a sound that was deafening in the decaying silence. I didn't wait. I slammed the car into gear and stomped on the accelerator. The tires spun in the loose dust, then caught. The car lurched forward, speeding down the dirt road, away from the silent, grasping mob. I looked in the rearview mirror. The crowd had stopped at the edge of town, unable or unwilling to leave the borders of their dying valley. But standing just behind them, at the very entrance to Havenwood, was the tall, cloaked figure of the tithe collector. It was watching me leave. It raised a single, long hand, not in threat, but in a slow, deliberate wave. A gesture that felt like a final, chilling dismissal. It had not claimed its tithe, but the valley had, and the contract, in its own terrible way, had been fulfilled. I drove for what felt like hours, my foot pressed to the floor, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the tall, cloaked figure appear on the empty road behind me, but there was nothing. Just a lonely highway and the growing distance between me and the nightmare of Havenwood. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-rattling shock and a crushing wave of guilt. I had escaped, but what had I left behind? A town of living ghosts, a community sentenced to a slow, grey decay, all because of my academic pride and my foolish defiance. The faces of the townsfolk, hollow and accusing, were burned into my memory. I finally pulled over at a brightly lit, all-night gas station, a garish beacon of normality in the darkness. I felt like a man emerging from a shipwreck. I stumbled out of the car, my legs unsteady. I just needed to see another human face, to hear a normal voice, to reassure myself that the real world still existed. I walked into the small convenience store. The air conditioning was a cold shock. A young man with headphones sat behind the counter, lazily scrolling through his phone. He didn't look up. "Help you," he mumbled, his voice bored and disinterested. "No, I'm fine," I stammered, my voice hoarse. I just stood there for a moment, basking in the mundane glory of fluorescent lights and rows of candy bars. It was all so wonderfully, beautifully normal. I grabbed a bottle of water and went to the counter to pay. The clerk finally looked up from his phone, his eyes flicking over me with a brief, dismissive glance. I paid for the water, and as he handed me my change, I tried to make eye contact. I needed that small, human connection. "Thanks," I said. "Have a good night." He just grunted in response, his attention already back on his phone. He didn't see the terror in my eyes. He didn't see the dust of a dying town on my clothes. To him, I was just another customer. Another faceless transaction in the middle of the night. I walked back to my car, the bottle of water feeling heavy in my hand. The encounter should have been reassuring. Instead, it filled me with a new, creeping dread. The clerk's casual indifference, his complete lack of acknowledgement, it was a small thing, a normal thing, but in the shadow of what I had just experienced, it felt like a symptom of the same disease. The slow, creeping decay of connection. The quiet death of community. I had fled Havenwood, but I was beginning to realize that its sickness was everywhere. I didn't sleep that night. I ended up in a sterile motel room 100 miles from Havenwood, but the distance provided no comfort. The image of the tithe collector, waving goodbye, was seared into my mind. It was not a gesture of victory or defeat. It was a gesture of release. It was as if it had been bound to the valley by the same pact that gave the town its life. By destroying the contract, I had not only doomed the town, I had set the collector free. This thought, a cold, sharp shard of ice in my gut, changed everything. I was no longer just a man fleeing from the consequences of his actions. I was a man who had potentially unleashed a far greater threat upon the world. What was the tithe collector without its contract, without its valley? Was it just a powerless phantom, or was it now an untethered entity, free to wander, free to collect new, different tithes in new, unsuspecting places? I spent the next few days in a paranoid haze, compulsively checking the news on my laptop, scanning for anything unusual. I was looking for patterns, for whispers of the strange and unexplained. A town where the colors seemed a little duller. A community garden that withered overnight. A rash of sudden, inexplicable apathy in a small neighborhood. I found nothing. The world outside my motel room door continued on, oblivious and unchanged. My rational mind tried to reassert itself. I was traumatized. I had witnessed a horrifying, localized phenomenon, and now I was projecting my fears onto the entire world. The collector was gone. The story was over. I needed to pull myself together to try and build a new life from the ashes of the old one. I tried. I found a small apartment in a new, anonymous city. I started applying for jobs, mundane academic positions that had nothing to do with secluded towns or ancient history. I tried to be normal. I forced myself to go to cafes, to walk in parks, to be around people. I made a conscious effort to be polite, to smile at strangers, to greet my neighbors. My interactions were tinged with a desperate, fearful energy, but I was trying. For a few weeks, it almost worked. The memories of Havenwood began to feel like a distant, feverish dream. The world was solid, and real again. The tithe collector was a ghost from a past I had successfully escaped. Then, one evening, I was walking home from the grocery store. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. A man walking towards me on the sidewalk, a businessman in a sharp suit, was shouting angrily into his phone, completely oblivious to the world around him. As he passed me, he failed to notice an elderly woman struggling with her groceries. He bumped into her, knocking a bag from her hands. Apples rolled across the pavement. He didn't stop. He didn't apologize. He just kept walking, his angry tirade continuing uninterrupted. It was a small, ugly moment of everyday rudeness, the kind of thing you see in a city a dozen times a day. But as I knelt down to help the woman gather her apples, I felt it. A sudden, sharp drop in the temperature, a profound, unnatural stillness in the air. I looked up and I saw him, standing at the far end of the street, half hidden in the long shadows of the setting sun, was a tall, thin figure in a dark cloak. And he was watching us. My blood ran cold. It was him, unchanged. Unmistakable, he was here, in this city, miles away from his dying valley. I hadn't been projecting. He was real, and he was free. He stood there for a long moment, a silent, patient observer, his featureless face turned towards the businessman who was now disappearing around a corner. He was not looking at me. I was no longer his concern. He had found a new target. I helped the shaken old woman to her feet, my mind racing. What could I do? Call the police? Tell them a man in a cloak was looking at someone menacingly? They would think I was insane. Confronting myself. The memory of his cold, implacable power made that thought laughable. As I stood there, helpless, the tall figure turned its attention from the departed businessman and looked directly at me. There was no recognition, no malice. It was a blank, empty gaze. Then, it simply dissolved. It did not walk away or fade. It just dissipated into the evening shadows, as if it had never been there at all. I was left trembling on the sidewalk, the old woman's thank yous barely registering in my ears. I knew what was going to happen. I knew the businessman was now marked for a tithe. I didn't know what form it would take, a loss of fortune, a loss of love, a loss of life, but I knew the collector would claim its due. This was my new reality. I was a Cassandra, cursed to see the phantom hunter as he moved through the world, selecting his victims, and utterly powerless to stop him. I was now a witness to a silent, invisible plague of cosmic justice. That night, I went back to my apartment and began my real work. My life as a historian was over. My new life was that of a chronicler, a tracker of the untethered. I created a new, encrypted online identity. I began to build a digital archive, a quiet corner of the web where I could document every sighting, every potential victim, every strange, unexplained event that followed in his wake. I searched for patterns. The victims were always the same, not criminals, not evil people, just the casually cruel, the callously indifferent, the selfish, the rude, people who, in small everyday ways, eroded the bonds of community. The collector was not a force of chaos. It was a force of balance, a terrifying, absolute, and merciless force of balance. And I was its unwilling prophet. My life became a grim, obsessive routine. Days were spent scanning local news feeds from across the country, searching for small, inexplicably, a successful CEO who suddenly loses everything overnight, a beloved celebrity whose voice mysteriously vanishes, a politician known for his arrogance who is found wandering the streets, his memory wiped clean. The stories were disconnected, happening hundreds of miles apart, but I saw the pattern. I knew the cause. Nights were spent on the street. I became a creature of the dusk, walking through the city, watching, listening. I was not looking for him anymore. I was looking for his triggers. I watched the interactions of the anonymous crowds, the small kindnesses, the casual cruelties. I saw 100 potential targets every night, and every now and then I would feel it. The telltale drop in temperature, the sudden unnatural silence, and I would see him, a fleeting shadow in a doorway or a tall, still figure at the end of an alley, observing, judging. I never interfered again. I had learned my lesson. I was a passive observer, a record keeper for the apocalypse of apathy. My website, my digital archive, grew. It was a collection of ghost stories where the ghosts were still alive and the hauntings were meticulously documented news clippings. I posted my findings on obscure forums, hoping to warn others, hoping someone would see the same patterns I did. Most dismissed it as fiction, a well-crafted creepypasta, but a very few, responded. They were people like me, people who had seen a tall, cloaked figure in the wake of a small, ugly moment. We were a small, scattered fellowship of unwilling witnesses. One night, I received an encrypted email from one of my fellow observers. It contained a link to a recently unearthed historical document. It was a letter written in the 17th century by a Puritan minister. In it, he described a silent spectre that stalked his new colony, a collector of behavioral debts that would render a tax upon the soul of the impolite. But the most chilling part was the minister's description of the entity's ultimate purpose. He believed it was not just a punisher. He believed it was a gardener. It was weeding the garden of humanity, slowly, patiently, removing the choking weeds of discourtesy to allow the virtuous fruit to grow stronger. It was not a malevolent force. In its own terrifying alien way, it was trying to help us. It was trying to save us from ourselves, one small, brutal act of cosmic enforcement at a time. The minister's letter from the 17th century was a horrifying revelation. It reframed everything. The tithe collector wasn't just a rogue entity I had accidentally set free. It was an ancient, planetary force, a kind of immune system for human society. And it had been performing its grim work for centuries. The pact with Havenwood hadn't created it. It had merely trapped and localized it, turning the valley into a lightning rod for its power. By breaking the contract, I hadn't unleashed it. I had just, restored it to its factory settings. This new knowledge did not bring comfort. It brought a deeper, more profound terror. The problem was not a monster I could hunt or a ghost I could banish. The problem was us. It was human nature. The creature was not the disease. It was the brutal, agonizing cure. My work became even more obsessive. I was no longer just a chronicler of its actions. I was a student of its methods, its philosophy. I built an algorithm to crawl news sites, flagging articles with key phrases: sudden downfall, unexplained reversal of fortune, mysterious ailment. My database grew, a terrifying, global map of its silent, tireless work. I saw its hand everywhere. A belligerent radio host who built a career on insults, suddenly struck mute by a mysterious throat condition. A ruthless CEO, famous for his hostile takeovers, whose company collapses overnight from a single, inexplicable accounting error. A viral internet troll who specialized in harassment, found catatonic in front of his keyboard, his online identity. completely erased. The punishments were always perfectly, poetically just. It didn't just hurt its victims. It took from them the very thing they used to cause their offense. The arrogant speaker lost his voice. The greedy tycoon lost his wealth. The anonymous troll lost his identity. It was a level of justice that no human court could ever hope to achieve. And I began to feel a strange, creeping sense of understanding. I did not condone its methods. They were horrific, but I could no longer deny the quiet, brutal logic behind them. The world was full of casual cruelty, and the collector was the only thing holding it accountable. One evening, I was walking through a crowded park. I saw a young man talking on his phone, laughing loudly, while his unsupervised child was bullying a smaller kid, pushing him to the ground. And I felt it, the familiar cold, the silence. I looked over and saw the tall, cloaked figure standing under a tree, watching, and for the first time, I did not feel fear. I felt a cold, quiet sense of grim satisfaction. The gardener had found another weed. That moment in the park was my undoing. The moment I felt that flicker of cold satisfaction, I had crossed a line. I had stopped being a horrified witness and had become an accomplice in my heart. I was no longer just studying the gardener. I was starting to admire the clean, orderly garden he was creating. I am writing this final entry from a place I never thought I would be again. I am back in Haven Wood. After that day in the park, I drove here, drawn by an impulse I didn't understand. The town is as I left it, a grey, crumbling ruin, a testament to my original sin. But it is not empty. Standing in the center of the town square, waiting for me, was the tithe collector. It did not feel threatening. It felt expectant. As I approached, it did something I had never seen it do before. It lowered its hood. There was no face underneath, just a swirling, gentle void of soft, grey mist. And from that mist, a voice spoke, not with words, but directly into my mind. It was a voice of infinite age and infinite weariness. You see now, it said, the garden is vast, and the gardener is old. My work is endless, but you understand the work. You see the necessity. You are the only one who does. I understood then, this was not a punishment. It was a job offer. The collector wasn't a singular entity, it was a title, a role, a burden passed down through the ages. And the previous one was tired. The contract you broke was not just a prison, the voice continued. It was also a succession plan. It provided a warden, a replacement, should the gardener ever falter. You have proven you understand the balance. You have proven you see the weeds. It extended a long, thin hand, not made of shadow, but of the same soft, grey mist. The garden needs a new tender. The tithe must be collected. Will you accept the contract? I am looking at its outstretched hand. Now as I finish this, I know what happens if I say no. I will be just another weed, and it will continue its lonely work. But if I say yes, I will become the very thing I once ran from. I will have the power to enforce a perfect, terrible kindness upon the world. I will have a purpose. I came here to find a monster, and in the end, I found a mirror. And I am horrified to admit, I am starting to like what I see. I think I will take the job. After all, the world could use a little more politeness, and I am a very patient teacher.